On February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. On May 18th of that same year, Finland and Sweden formally applied to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which is the world's most powerful alliance. On July 5th, NATO formally began the accession process. And then we sat around and waited, and waited and waited, and waited. Finally, on April 4th, 2023, Finland became a member. But Sweden? Well, at the time of this recording, we are still waiting. And if you want to know who is responsible, well, Turkey and Hungary are the ones holding up the show. Today, we are going to discuss both Hungary's reasons and Turkey's reasons for objecting, the legal capacity that allows Hungary and Turkey to veto Sweden's entry, why NATO adopted such a voting rule in the first place, the hidden game that works behind the scenes around those rules, and some of the side benefits NATO enjoys by jumping through all of these hoops. We begin with Hungary's objection because it is the simpler of the two. Basically, it comes down to Hungary not appreciating Sweden's reaction to democratic backsliding. Both are members of the European Union, and rules for membership in the EU are outlined by the Copenhagen criteria. Half the criteria are focused on free markets and the ability to withstand competitive economic pressures. Remember, the EU started out as a trading bloc for coal and steel. But the other half focus on governance, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Sweden has been critical of Hungary's evolving politics since Viktor Orbán became prime minister, and Hungary would like Sweden to cut that out. Though it is not like Sweden's perspective on Hungary is unpopular within the EU or NATO as a whole. Turkey's objections are a bit more layered. The Swedish government has also been critical of Turkey's democratic backsliding under Erdogan. This has slightly less bite than the situation with Hungary, because Turkey is not a member of the European Union, though there are some expectations within NATO's framework for good democratic governance, and that will come into play a little bit later on in this video. Instead, the problem revolves around the Kurdish ethnic group, a nation without a state that ranges across Iran, Iraq, Syria, and yes, Turkey. It's almost like a cruel joke, because it would be difficult to find a more eventful quad-state area over the last 2 decades, yet there they are. But our focus is on Turkey, and Turkey, just like the other 3 states, has been historically concerned about Kurdish autonomy and independence movements. No matter which state it may originate in, it is a threat to Turkish power. Within Turkey specifically, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, has the starring role in Sweden's NATO holdup. The PKK is especially concerning for Turkey because it is a militant political group with the goal of, you guessed it, establishing an independent Kurdistan, and a touch of communism, though like most of the rest of the world, they dropped that in the 1990s. The period since then has been an ebbing and flowing of armed conflict with Ankara. Although Sweden does not actively support the PKK or similar political groups, Turkey would prefer that Sweden take an active role in assisting Turkey's policing of them, including the extradition of human rights activists. They have met for ratification summits in Finland, Sweden, and Belgium, and perhaps soon again in Turkey, but so far it's all been to no avail. For what it's worth, Turkey's main opposition party is more amenable to Sweden's entry, if they ever come into power. It would not happen overnight. They still care about the PKK issue. But all of that effectively became a moot point for the foreseeable future, with Erdogan's election win in May. Combine that with how Russia matters a great deal for Turkey's economic outlook, with the Turk Stream pipeline and Russia's current construction of a nuclear power plant along Turkey's southern coast, and you get a tough veto player in the fold. But on a more basic level, why do Hungary and Turkey's votes matter here at all? The answer is in NATO's rules for expansion. The North Atlantic Treaties Article 10 dictates that current members must unanimously agree for another country to join. Back when the treaty was originally written, Article 10's total agreement provision might not have seemed so bad. It was only a small group. Only 12 votes were required back then. But as NATO expanded during the Cold War, and then accelerated afterward, it became a taller task. Today, there are 31 countries, now including Finland. The rest of them have approved Sweden, so it really does all come down to Hungary and Turkey at this point. Side note, Finland's vote does actually matter here, even though they were trying to enter at the same time. There is a humorous alternate reality where Finland opted for the ultimate heel turn and raced to get in just for the purpose of vetoing Sweden. But that is not the universe we live in. This one is. The fact that there are two holdouts might not be surprising. Getting 31 of anything to all agree to something is a challenge. Just think about how little the United Nations Security Council gets done, and they only have 5 countries with veto power there. That leads to the question of why NATO set up the system like this in the first place. To answer that, we must move from Article 10 to Article 5. This is the vaunted "an attack against one is an attack against all" provision. Deterring opposing countries with it requires that the opposing countries actually believe you. That's the central problem with international institutions, be it the UN, NATO, or otherwise. They only go so far as countries voluntarily comply with them, or at least have their compliance forced by the threat of another country's military. It goes without saying that NATO does not want to militarily coerce its own members into helping the military alliance. Even the construction of that sentence is bizarre. Unanimity attempts to align those incentives. If an existing member objects to defending the would-be NATO member, well, there is a time to raise that reservation. It's the accession process. That's the last opportunity to make that known. Of course, obtaining unanimous approval does not actually mean that all countries have to be happy about Sweden's entry to still have the vote work properly. You can be a Sadie McSadface. Instead, let's talk about all of the weird games being played underneath the official rules, beginning with bribery. Actually, bribery is a naughty word. How about we call it inducements? This is what many believe is Hungary's and Turkey's real endgame. The basic idea here is that Sweden's NATO membership is not a binary choice. It's not just Sweden out or Sweden in. It's those options with Turkey and Hungary receiving some variable amount of money. Even if you think that they are collectively losing the equivalent of, say, $10 billion by having Sweden join, as long as the collective benefits to Sweden and the other NATO countries is greater than that, those countries can grease the wheels with good old-fashioned cash transfers to get the job done. Conceptually, this does not have to stop at money, and although meatballs and self-assembled furniture will likely not be enough, inducements could just as easily apply to policies like critiques of democratic backsliding or insufficient help against opposition groups. There are 3 small problems with this. First, it raises questions within the alliance of who should bear the higher burden in paying out the inducements. Second, especially in this case, member states may be skeptical that Hungary and Turkey are actively harmed by Sweden's accession, and so they call what they perceive as a bluff by offering no money, or refusal to terminate criticism of autocratic tendencies. This can delay the process unnecessarily while the sides sort out the truths from bluffs. Finally, the presence of bribes invalidates the original purpose of the unanimity rule. Remember, consent for entry is supposed to be tacit pre-approval for Article 5. But if Hungary is just admitting Sweden to get money, why would others believe Hungary will support Sweden when push comes to shove? And these 3 problems ignore how Russia can apply economic inducements going the other way. Paying for Turk Stream gas developments and nuclear power plants makes a lot more sense when viewed as a trivial price to limit NATO expansion. The flip side of the inducement coin is coercion. Rather than bribe Hungary and Turkey to let Sweden in, the other members can threaten the pair with negative consequences if they refuse to yield. Standard economic sanctions, like what the West imposed against Russia in response to the war, are unlikely. That would undermine public unity and the friendly nature of the alliance, which would defeat the point of having Sweden enter. Instead, other member states can drag their feet on assisting Hungary or Turkey on non-Article 5 matters. For example, in February 2023, U.S. Congress held up $20 billion in sales of F-16 fighter jets to Turkey because of the Finland and Sweden issue. After Turkey greenlit Finland's membership, the State Department approved a $259 million software update to Turkey's existing F-16 arsenal. However, sales of new planes remained off the table until Turkey permits Sweden's accession. There are also three more exotic solutions to the problem. The likelihood that any of these happen is close to zero, because they would cause giant headaches for everyone involved. But the possibility has to concern Hungary and Turkey if they were to stall forever. The first of these is to functionally kick them out. The word functionally did a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because actual removal is easier said than done. The North Atlantic Treaty has no provision to remove a country from NATO. The closest thing to that falls under Article 13, where a country can voluntarily leave after 1 year's notice. During the original 1949 negotiations, Canada had pushed for an actual removal clause, largely concerned about what might happen if a member's government turned against the West. However, two countervailing factors quashed that discussion. One, Article 5 would lose some of its credibility if the treaty signaled membership concerns. Remember, this was 1949. Article 5 did not have the 7 decades of mythos behind it that it has now. There was no guarantee at the start that the Soviet Union, or any other country, would believe a word of it. Speaking of the Soviet Union, the second factor was communism. If a NATO country were to abandon Western governance, the only conceivable path at the time was to become a communist regime. That would mean linking up with the Soviet Union and joining what would later become the Warsaw Pact. Put differently, NATO did not need to kick anyone out, because in Soviet America, America kicks itself out. Nevertheless, there are a couple creative workarounds here. The first paragraph of Article 5 gets all of the attention, but the second paragraph explains that actually invoking it means convening a consultation on how to respond to an enemy attack. Technically, members are only required to respond by taking actions that they deem appropriate. If the United States feels like a member state is being obstructionist, it could respond to an attack on that member state, not by raising a massive army, but rather by playing the world's smallest violin. Effectively, Hungary and Turkey could be denied the real benefits of NATO membership, while still technically being in the club. That would raise long-term questions about Article 5's vaunted status, and it does not fully solve the problem of needing their votes to admit Sweden, but it does add to the coercive force. To actually terminate their membership, a more ridiculous solution may exist. This relies on an obscure provision in 1969's Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Wait a second, you might say. This is a treaty on treaties? Yeah, that's actually a real thing. They made a treaty for treaties, so you can treaty while you treaty. In all seriousness, think of it as a governing document on how states format treaties and construct international institutions. Article 60 of the Convention dictates that a country's membership in a treaty is void if that country is in material breach of that treaty. Pair this with the preamble of the North Atlantic Treaty, which dictates that parties to the treaty are to safeguard freedom and democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, and maybe you are making a case to remove Hungary and Turkey from the alliance. However, Turkey never signed the Vienna Convention, and the United States never ratified it. In any case, if NATO ever went down this route, Vladimir Putin will happily pop some popcorn, sit back, and watch the alliance burn. That was part of his plan for the invasion of Ukraine, after all. So as friendly as Putin has been with the countries in question, it is probably better if you do not count on this one to solve the alliance's problems. If you can't kick someone out, the next best thing is to just create a parallel group. Call it fake NATO, or just FNATO, or better yet, embrace the memes, get all your fellas together, and call it NAFO. Invite everyone to it, except the obstructionists. Then convert all NATO facilities into NAFO facilities. NATO still exists on paper, but is now functionally meaningless. It is all about NAFO now. And if you play your cards right, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense will thank you for your efforts. Is this a silly solution? Well, it involves a Shiba Inu dressed as a Ukrainian soldier, with a HIMARS launch going on in the background. So I'll let you be the judge of that one. The point here is not that this is going to happen. Sorry, NAFO. Rather, the lack of direct enforceability of international institutions does not obligate the rest of NATO to protect Hungary and Turkey. They know that there are limits to NATO's patience, which will shape the deal that ultimately forms to get Sweden into NATO, to raise Sweden's flag next to Finland's, and avoid having the puppers take over. We have spent a long time discussing the ridiculousness of the unanimity rule, so let's end with why there are some hidden benefits to it. For one thing, paying out inducements every time a new country joins incentivizes the fringe parts of the alliance to stay in. Turkey is an important part of NATO's geographic positioning, giving the alliance a foothold into Asia. But ask yourself this: how confident are you that Turkey would stay in NATO over the long term without, shall we say, special privileges? Probably. But from NATO's perspective, I'd also wager that the risk is not worth withholding the relatively small payments. And for all this talk of Turkey slowing down the process, Finland's accession into NATO was still the fastest in history. The delay also has a strategic function in regard to NATO's opponents. NATO membership shifts the coercive bargaining power favorably for both the new addition and the alliance as a whole. They can better protect themselves against, say, Russian incursions. This incentivizes opposing states, like Russia, to disrupt that process via preventive war. Think about the calculation here. What determines whether preventive war is worthwhile is a comparison between the shift in the balance of power and the length of time it will take to complete, versus the costs and risks of initiating a conflict. The longer the expectation, the weaker the desire the opposing state has to fight. In this way, Article 10's unanimity rule guards against external disruption of the alliance. More generally, the elongated period ensures that the new members truly have settled their boundary disputes before entering, which is something that NATO wants to see before admitting entry, though this notably caused a big problem in 2008 for Georgia. Will NATO fumble the ball on the 1-yard line? Let me know in the... Wait, what's that? The majority of my audience is non-American? But Canadians play gridiron football too. Fine. Will NATO blow the Swedish slam dunk? Let me know in the comments. You know what else is a slam dunk? Learning more about the invasion by reading my book that investigates its many possible causes. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Take care. We just had an entire video about Hungary and Turkey. And, for the record, I took the high road without making a single obvious joke. But, did you know that the word for Turkey actually comes from, well, Turkey? The best anyone can tell, Spain shipped turkey from Turkey to Britain, and the name just stuck. Now, the president regularly pardons a couple of the birds every November. Perhaps as a sign of NATO goodwill?